Within just a few days after the French army took Alexandria by storm, the commander-in-chief ordered preparations for a march to Cairo. Bonaparte was convinced that any delay would be fatal and that they needed to enter Cairo as quickly as possible, preventing the enemy from fortifying this large city. There were two roads from Alexandria to Cairo, and Bonaparte planned the march as follows. A division under the command of General Dugas would go along the coast to Rosetta and then turn south, following the Nile to the village of Rahmani. The French would have to cover over 55 miles along this route. This route was the longest among the possibilities, but it was also the easiest, as the troops would have continual access to fresh water. General Kleber, who had not yet fully recovered from his injury, remained in Alexandria to command a 2,000-strong garrison. General Manu, also wounded, was to lead the garrison in Rosetta. The main part of the army would take the shortest path through the desert. In Rahmani, Bonaparte planned to reunite the army and continue the march to Cairo already along the Nile, accompanied by Admiral Perde's light squadron. Despite the scorching heat in Egypt at that time, crossing the desert did not raise particular concerns. Alexandria was not far from Damanhur, just over 30 miles. The French had covered this distance in less than 2 days during the Italian campaign. However, the current situation turned out to be much more horrifying. On July 4th, Desaix's division set out first into the desert. To avoid the heat, the troops began their movement in the evening and marched through the night. However, within a day of marching, the soldiers experienced a stark contrast to the beautiful fields of Lombardy. What was marked on the map as villages turned out to be abandoned huts with wells filled with sand. As a result, the troops quickly exhausted their water supplies and began to suffer terribly under the blazing sun. Even General Desaix, who extremely rarely expressed dissatisfaction, sent daily reports to Bonaparte complaining about the unbearable conditions and urgently requesting supplies and water. I am in great need of supplies. The villages are no more than clay huts devoid of all resources. Troops are losing morale and starting to grumble. I implore you, General, do not leave us in this situation. As soon as we get out of this dreadful situation, I hope I can find what I need on my own and never bother you again. I'm distressed that I have to speak to you in such a concerned tone, but if the entire army doesn't cross the desert swiftly, it will perish. Following Desaix, the other divisions marched along the same route. The commander-in-chief and his staff joined the troops in the desert on July 7th. Before leaving Alexandria, Bonaparte ordered Admiral Bruess to find the necessary waterway and station the squadron in the port of Alexandria, or, if that wasn't possible, to sail to a safer location near the island of Corfu. Meanwhile, the condition of the French forces marching through the desert rapidly deteriorated. Just before the start of the march, the Bedouin tribes had received a fatwa from the ulamas and sheikhs of Cairo, instructing them to take up arms to defend the faith of the Prophet against the infidels. This changed their previously amicable intentions. They nullified all agreements with the French and began to see them as enemies. The Bedouins were constantly on the flanks, behind and in front of the army. They skillfully ambushed any soldiers who fell behind them, killing them. The army was engulfed in a kind of terror. Everything was unknown to them. The soldiers' fevered imaginations generated various rumors. Rumors spread among the troops that a Mamluk horseman was so strong that he could decapitate a bull with a single blow of his sword. Nonetheless, the soldiers had no other choice but to march forward on the scorching sand. Many soldiers went mad while the columns trudged forward, and a few even shot themselves. All of this pushed many units to the verge of mutiny. The mood among the senior officers wasn't much better, and Bonaparte had to respond harshly to it to maintain control over the army. Never before had an army had to endure such great vicissitudes and painful deprivations. Stricken by the scorching rays of the sun, everyone marched on foot across even more scorching sands, crossing vast plains of daunting aridity. I saw soldiers, renowned for their physical strength, fall from exhaustion, overcome by thirst and heat. deceptive, watery plains seemed to offer us respite from our miseries, but this illusion was only there to plunge us into even greater despondency. My assistance became almost useless. The loss of strength of some of our bravest men had reached its limit. Nevertheless, I managed to revive quite a significant number of soldiers with a small amount of fresh water diluted with drops of sweet wine that I carried with me. Numerous Arab legions followed our march, constantly harassing our detachments. Woe to the soldiers who fell out of line. A painful death awaited them. Yet, after the most arduous marches, Bonaparte gathered 4 demoralized divisions in Damanhur and gave them 2 days of rest. This small town became a true salvation for the soldiers. There, they found enough clean water to quench their thirsts and refresh themselves, as well as to buy provisions at the local market. Surprisingly for the French, the market traders preferred payment in the form of buttons from the soldiers' uniforms rather than money. After a 2-day respite in Damanhur, the French, having gathered their strength, embarked on another challenging march to Rahmani, and finally, on July 10th, the exhausted soldiers caught sight of the Nile River. As soon as we saw the river, officers, soldiers, and everyone else rushed into it. Not a single soldier stopped to take off his uniform and knapsack. Each one was eager to quench his thirst and bent down to drink. The entire army in this way resembled a herd of sheep to me. After leaving the river, we found ourselves in fields covered with a multitude of melons and watermelons, which soon made us forget the suffering of the desert. Indeed, as we approached the Nile, the landscape of the country changed dramatically. The lushest vegetation met our gaze. Trees, which we hadn't seen since leaving Italy, offered us their shade, the value of which can only be appreciated by those who have walked through a desert. Thus, all divisions were assembled on the banks of the Nile, and a small squadron of Admiral Perde anchored alongside the army. On the night of July 11th, the French resumed their march to Cairo. The soldiers no longer suffered from a lack of water. They also had an abundance of such foods as melons, watermelons, rice, and lentils. The only things missing were bread and wine. And in the meantime, the Mamluks began to take countermeasures. In Cairo, an emergency divan convened to discuss the situation. Mamluk beys, sheikhs, and other emirs attended the divan. When Murad Bey heard that the armies of infidels had a sizable infantry but lacked cavalry, he laughed loudly and declared that they would cut them down like watermelons. This filled those present with optimism. Everyone was certain of victory over the foreign infantry, and each Mamluk promised to bring 100 French heads to Cairo. In the end, the divan decided to divide the available army. Murad Bey, with 3,000 Mamluks and several thousand Janissaries, was to go along the Nile to delay the French, while Ibrahim Bey was tasked with assembling the remaining troops near Cairo. So, gathering his desert knights, Murad Bey set out to meet the French. Finally, at dawn on July 13th, near the village of Shubrakit, the French saw Murad Bey's cavalry before them. The sun, reflecting off the Mamluks' helmets and armor, gave this splendid army a special brilliance. For several hours, the troops stood and observed each other. To intimidate the enemy, the Mamluks demonstrated their equestrian skills on their magnificent Arabian steeds. Each warrior carried an entire arsenal. In addition to their carbine, each Mamluk was armed with a pair of pistols, several pikes, and a scimitar studded with precious stones. However, this spectacle had no intimidating effect on the veterans of the Italian campaign. To boost the morale of his troops, Bonaparte ordered the playing of the Marseillaise. After that, the command was given to form a square.
Par peloton de droite et de gauche, formez le carré!
At sunrise, martial music suddenly burst forth. The commander-in-chief ordered the Marseillaise to be played because he knew its effect on the troops. This wonderful song inflames the courage of the soldiers, kindles their patriotism, and makes them understand that the time for complaints has passed and that victory is their main task. The formation of the French army did not perturb Murad Bey, and around 8 a.m., the Mamluk cavalry launched an attack. As soon as the enemy came into range, the French opened heavy fire. The roar of the artillery did not frighten the Mamluks, and they galloped through the French ranks to attack them from behind. However, the Mamluks were surprised to find that the infantry was protected from all sides. After this, they began to dart around the infantry square in confusion, looking for weak points. This continued for about half an hour, after which the Mamluks withdrew and returned to their original positions. Meanwhile, a much fiercer battle was taking place on the Nile. Around 9 a.m., 5 small French vessels were in a precarious position, battling against 7 larger Mamluk ships. Around 11 a.m., Admiral Perde informed me that if the land forces did not come to his aid immediately, the situation would be hopeless. The Mamluks had already boarded several ships, killing our sailors with barbaric fury, and then showing us the severed heads, holding them by the hair. What they witnessed had a shocking effect on the scholars who were on the transport boats nearby. Some of them were ready to jump into the river to avoid falling into the hands of the Mamluks. However, the situation improved when Bonaparte ordered field artillery to be brought to support the fleet, and at 12 a.m., the Mamluk flagship was successfully blown up by a well-aimed shot. At the same time, Bon's division advanced and drove the enemy infantry out of the village of Shubrakit. As a result, after a brief resistance, Murad Bey decided to retreat to Cairo. This brief battle at Shubrakit shook the Mamluks' confidence. Cairo was quickly filled with alarming rumors. The infidels advancing on Cairo have nails of a foot long, huge mouths, and ferocious eyes. They are savages possessed by the devil, and they go into battle in chains. On the contrary, the French gained confidence after this battle, and all the fears caused by the unknown were dispelled. The march to Cairo continued, and on July 20th, the French reached the village of Dinar, which was 18 miles from Cairo. Bonaparte ordered the entire army to form a square and march towards the capital. Leading the way, to the beat of drums, was Desaix's division. Finally, on the morning of July 21st, Napoleon's 18,000-strong army reached the village of Bitil, and before the French, a majestic scene unfolded. To the right of them, the pyramids loomed, and at first, all eyes were focused on these great ancient monuments. To the left of the French, on the opposite bank of the Nile, were the magnificent mosques of Cairo, and in the center, the Mamluk army stood with unfurled banners and tents. This sight left a vivid impression on the soldiers due to its novelty and richness. From this moment on, their thoughts were solely focused on the upcoming battle. In total, the Beys were able to gather around 30,000 people for the defense of Cairo, but only about 12,000 of them could effectively engage in combat. The others were armed with sticks and were incapable of taking action in battle formation on the plains. The main force that could resist the French, as before, was the Mamluks. There were about 7,000 of them under the walls of Cairo. Also, on the right flank of Murad Bey's army, there was an Imbamware fortified camp defended by several thousand janissaries. Ibrahim Bey's militia was on the island of Bulak. Bonaparte applied the same tactics as in the Battle of Shubrakit. Each division was formed into a huge infantry square, 6 ranks deep. Vulnerable corners were covered by artillery. The small number of cavalry was in the center of the square. On the right flank was Desaix's square, supported on the left by Regnier's division. Vial and Bonn were on the left flank, opposite the enemy camp. In the center was Dugas' division, inside of the square of which Bonaparte and his staff were positioned. The superiority of the French was evident. However, after a grueling march, the soldiers were significantly weakened, and the slightest panic could lead to a catastrophe. Therefore, everything depended on discipline and order. Moreover, Bonaparte's army was effectively surrounded, since Bedouins following the French had already cut off all the roads. Finally, the drums beat, and Bonaparte said to his troops, pointing to the pyramids, "Forward, soldiers, and remember that 40 centuries are watching you from the tops of these pyramids." At around 3 p.m., 7,000 horsemen rushed to the attack with wild shouts. The main hit was directed at the French right flank, but the division squares closed ranks in time and met the attackers with musket volleys. Very quickly, Desaix's square found itself completely surrounded and isolated from the others. Communication between the infantry squares was lost. Due to the smoke and dust in the air, Desaix's division was barely visible, and in those moments of uncertainty, many became anxious for the right flank. In the chaos, it seemed that the Mamluks were about to break the square's formation. However, the musket volleys coming from the right flank signaled that Desaix's division was still holding its ground. The division commander and his subordinates displayed exceptional fortitude and composure. Withstanding the initial Mamluk assault, Desaix ordered his troops to close ranks and fire when ready.
Serrez vos rangs! Feu de file!
General Regnier's infantry square was also surrounded and subjected to numerous attacks. However, the crossfire from the two divisions inflicted serious losses on the Mamluks. After mass attacks on the French left flank, the Mamluks streamed into the village of Bitild, where several grenadier companies were stationed. However, the soldiers managed to rush into the houses and put up an effective defense. In the end, 2 grenadier companies under Dorsen's command successfully repelled the cavalry attack, which proved ineffective in urban combat. For another hour, the Mamluks continued to launch violent attacks on infantry squares, but they were met with a hail of fire everywhere. Their courage was impressive, but courage alone is not enough to defeat a disciplined army in proper battle formation. Meanwhile, after ensuring that the right flank had repelled the cavalry attack, Bonaparte, on the opposite flank, ordered General Bond's division to counterattack.
En avant! Marche!
The assault columns were led into the attack by Brigadier General Rampon. The enemy's artillery fire didn't deter the French, and in less than 15 minutes, Rampon's soldiers, with a bayonet charge, crushed the Janissary corps and destroyed the Mbambwer fortified camp. The surviving Mamluks and Janissaries, in desperation, began throwing themselves into the Nile, attempting to swim across to join Ibrahim Bey's forces, who just watched what was happening. However, not everyone managed to swim across the Nile. Thus, the Mamluk camp was defeated, and all the cavalry attacks were repelled. This brief battle ended around 4:30 p.m. The French army lost about 300 men, killed and wounded, while the enemy lost over 3,000 people killed, wounded, and drowned. Murad Bey and the surviving 3,000 Mamluks fled to Giza. Ibrahim Bey left Cairo during the night and went to the east. After the flight of the Mamluks, Cairo was engulfed in a wave of looting, panic, and riots. Horrified by the situation, the sheikhs and imams of Cairo approached the French for negotiations the next day. Bonaparte declared that the French army would not harm either the city or its residents. The French only wished to enter Cairo in an orderly and disciplined manner. The delegation was pleased with the reception it received and hastened back to Cairo to reassure the inhabitants. As a result, on July 22nd, the French army entered Cairo. At Murad Bey's estate, the French discovered magnificent fruit orchards, vineyards, and many other eastern riches. On the same day, proclamations from the commander-in-chief were posted throughout the city. Residents of Cairo, I am pleased with your behavior. I have come to destroy the Mamluks, protect trade, and the country's native inhabitants. Let those who are consumed by fear find peace. Let those who have departed return. Let prayer go on today as usual. Do not fear for your families, homes, property, and especially for the religion of the Prophet, whom I greatly love. After this, the sheikhs of Cairo called Bonaparte the Just Sultan. However, instead of the sweet taste of victory, Bonaparte would soon face bitter disappointment. Talking with Junot, Bonaparte learned an unpleasant secret, revealing that Josephine had been unfaithful to him and had long had a lover in France. This news deeply affected Bonaparte. I have a great personal sorrow. All doubts have vanished. You alone remain for me on this earth. If I lose your friendship, I will go completely mad. It's so hard when all the love in my heart is given to one woman. I am disappointed in human nature. I need solitude and rest. I have grown tired of glory. My feelings have dried up, and I'm left with nothing but to become an egoist. However, Bonaparte would quickly forget his troubles with Josephine, as it wouldn't be more than 2 weeks before he and the entire army had to seriously consider their survival.